In today's video, we're going to continue our NHL Season Preview series for the upcoming 18-19 season. Today's team we're previewing is the Buffalo Sabres, and that's coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams. So if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, today we're completing a season preview for the 18-19 season for the Buffalo Sabres. Now as we know, the Buffalo Sabres were the 31st team in the league last year, Team 31, but they managed to get the first overall pick in the NHL draft. They've done a lot of other great things during this offseason, and they should look much different this year. In case this is the first video you've seen in our season preview series, we're going to break this down into 4 segments. The first segment, we're going to do a quick review here of the 17-18 team stats. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into their team results, analyze how they did last year. In segment 2, we're going to call that additions and subtractions, where we take a look at last year's roster compared to this year's roster and really compare how the team has changed year over year. In the third segment, we're going to look at the projected lineup for opening night. And then in the final segment, I'm going to give you my predictions and projections for how they will do in the upcoming season. So let's jump in here with the 17-18 season recap. So as I mentioned, the Buffalo Sabres were 31st in the league. Obviously, that puts them last in their division as well with a record of 25, 42, and 12 for 62 points. Now, fortunately, that did land them the first overall selection in the 2018 NHL draft, which obviously will be a great help to changing their team's fortunes, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But last year was certainly a really rough season for the Buffalo Sabres. They only scored 198 goals last year, which was also 31st, so they were the lowest scoring team in the NHL last season. They also gave up 278 goals against for 29th best in the NHL, so obviously not a great result on either side. That gives them a plus-minus rating here as a team is -80. So overall, like I said, things did not go well for the Buffalo Sabres in 17-18. It was certainly a really bad year, but like I said, there is a silver lining here to this team bouncing back. Now let's jump over here and take a look at their special teams results. They were a little bit better than some of the other numbers we've already thrown out here. Their power play finished at 19.1% for 20th best in the NHL, so overall, considering what they can put out on a power play, that's not too bad. Obviously needs to continue to improve if they're really going to get a shot here at being a playoff team. But still, considering how the rest of the year went, it's certainly not as bad as some of their other statistics. Their PK finished at 77.9% or 22nd best here in the NHL. So again, like their power play, certainly not fantastic by any means, but certainly not as bad as a lot of their other team stats for the year. When the Buffalo Sabres managed to score the first goal, they had a record of 20 wins, 9 losses, and 8 overtime losses. So compared to a lot of the other teams we've already covered here in the season previews, that is not one of the better records. So even scoring the first goal quite often did not mean a whole lot for this team. Yes, they did win 20 games by scoring the first goal, but still there's 9 losses and 8 overtime losses. So there's almost as many times that they turned out to either lose the game in regulation or overtime when they scored first as well. Now let's take a look here at the scoring breakdown by period to see if there's any kind of glaring observations we can make about their period by period breakdown. First periods were not good for the Buffalo Sabres. They were outscored by their opponents 76-46 for a -30 differential. Obviously, that's not a great way to start your game most of the time. So as we mentioned, there wasn't a lot of times they scored the first goal. And not only that, but multiple times after the first period, they were down by at least 1 goal. Second periods were even worse than the first periods, giving up 106 goals while only scoring 69. So even a worse result than the first periods at -37. So the first 2 periods of play, not great at all for the Buffalo Sabres. The third periods were probably the best of the bunch during last season. Still not a fantastic result, but certainly much better than their first and second period. They were still outscored, but by a smaller margin of 86-78 for a -8 rating. So obviously, quite often in the third period, they did score more goals than the first and second period. Try to make a comeback and, obviously quite often fell short, but at least scored the bulk of their goals later into the game. Obviously, that kind of shows that the Buffalo Sabres way too many times had poor starts, but stronger finishes, but quite often dug themselves too big of a hole that it just was too little too late on most nights. One decent statistic for them is when they were leading after 2 periods of play going into the third period, they had a record of 16-1-5. So that's not too bad really considering, but obviously there's not too many times here compared to the whole long season where they actually went into the third period with the lead. Now let's jump over here and take a look at their additions and subtractions. Now as I mentioned, this team has gone through quite a drastic overhaul. There's a lot of significant changes year over year. We're also going to take a look at some significant rookies that should impact their team this year as well. So let's take a look at their additions first. Now, obviously, they signed goaltender Carter Hutton through free agency, so obviously he's going to be the starting goaltender for this year. Obviously, Carter Hutton's had a couple of solid seasons with the St. Louis Blues, played with the Predators before that. For the most part, it's been a backup, but did play a little bit more than usual last year, and actually had a terrific season. So obviously, this will be the first time he's really going to be the starting goaltender, and he's a little bit older for a guy to get that first chance at that. So we'll see how he does here, but based on his current play, there's no reason to believe he won't be a pretty decent goaltender for Buffalo. Obviously, one of their most significant acquisitions for the year was Jeff Skinner from the Carolina Hurricanes. Obviously, that trade came later into the offseason, but it's going to be a tremendous pickup for the Buffalo Sabres. They really didn't have to give up a whole lot to get him either. Most of what they gave up was future considerations here through draft picks and prospects. So Jeff Skinner should be huge for the Buffalo Sabres this coming year. They also picked up guys like Connor Sheary through a trade with the Pittsburgh Penguins, where the Penguins needed to move some money off the books to kind of free up some salary cap space. Obviously, they made that big trade with the St. Louis Blues, where they ended up acquiring Patrick Berglund, Vladimir Sopoka, as well as Tage Thompson. Overall, those are some pretty significant additions for the Buffalo Sabres. Obviously, a lot of those players were acquired via trade, so let's take a look at the players that are no longer with the Sabres who had a significant role last season. Obviously, the biggest one would be top center iceman Ryan O'Reilly, who was traded to the St. Louis Blues in exchange for those three players that we mentioned with Sobotka, Berglund, and Thompson. Obviously, O'Reilly played a big role in his team. Certainly going to do the same in St. Louis, but he's certainly a very notable departure off this roster. Goaltender Robin Lehner's no longer with the club. They chose not to qualify him in as an RFA and let him walk as a free agent, who's now with the New York Islanders. They also let backup goaltender Chad Johnson go as well, and he ended up signing in St. Louis. So there certainly was a connection this year between Buffalo and St. Louis, with a lot of players changing teams, not only through that trade, but through free agency as well. So Johnson will now be the backup to Jake Allen in St. Louis this year. A few players off the roster who were UFAs walked, who were not re-signed, like Josh Georges, Benoit Pouliot, as well as Jordan Nolan. Now, as far as rookies that can make an impact, Buffalo is probably the team who has the most rookie power in the NHL, with star defenseman Rasmus Dahlin, who came first overall in the 2018 NHL draft. Obviously, some other teams have some pretty solid rookies as well, but there's not too many of them to have two that are really significant pieces to their long-term future here. Obviously, not only do they have Dahlin, but they also have center iceman Casey MIttlestadt. And with that O'Reilly trade, MIttlestadt should likely get time to be that number 2 center behind Jack Eichel. So those two players should have a very significant impact on this team. Obviously, if you take a look at some of the other top 6 forwards that brought in by the Sabres, like a Jeff Skinner and a Connor Sheary, you throw in like Jack Eichel, Kyle Okposo, other guys in the Sabres lineup here, they should have a really solid group of top 6 forwards who can certainly score lots of offense. You got guys like Dahlin adding to the back end with Ristolainen. This team has really changed significantly year over year, but these two rookies in MIttlestadt and Dahlin are going to have a huge impact on this team, not only this year, but in the years to come. They're really foundational players, I believe, that they can really build around long term here. Now let's take a look at the expected lineup here on opening night for the Buffalo Sabres. Obviously, in goal, you're going to have Carter Hutton, who we just talked about, who was signed as a free agent. Obviously, this is going to be the first kick at the can for Carter Hutton of being a starting goaltender. He's been a pretty solid backup in the NHL for some time now. I believe he's around 32 years of age, so he's a little bit older to get his first shot at being a really bona fide starting guy here. But based on what he did last year in St. Louis, I don't really have too many concerns over this. Obviously, the one concern I would have would be, can he handle the workload of a 60, 65 games played like a lot of top starters do in the NHL, where he's not used to playing that many games in a season. So obviously his backup, which will be youngster Linus Ullmark, hopefully can have at least 25 to 30 solid games, kind of take the pressure off of Hutton here. So obviously, with both goaltenders not being experienced as starters, that could potentially be a weakness longer term, but we'll see how Hutton can hold down the fort here. I do have a lot of faith in his ability to be a solid goalie, but it's just hard to say how many games he can handle here based on what he's used to in the past. Obviously, their decor will look much different having Rasmus Dahlin on the back end. So your top 6 defensemen here for opening night, more than likely you got Rasmus Ristolainen as well as Marco Scandella as your top pair. I do think Rasmus Dahlin will probably play with McCabe on your second pair. In your third pair, likely is going to be Nathan Beaulieu and Zach Bogosian. You also have Gouli, who could be the number 6 or number 7 guy as well. Hard to say how training camp goes. I do expect him to get a fair bit of action with the Sabres this year. Obviously, guys like Bogosian too have a bit of an injury history, so we'll see how things go. So I do expect Gouli to get a fair bit of time with the Sabres in their lineup this year. I'm not sure he'll be actively playing on opening night or not, because the other 6 guys obviously very well could be pushed ahead of him here, but depending on how training camp goes for him, I do expect him to get a fair bit of playing time. Now let's take a look here at their forward group for opening night. Obviously, they get newly signed restricted free agent Sam Reinhart as well under a contract which is going to be a big boost for them. It was looking like it could drag on later into the offseason here and potentially miss the beginning of the NHL season. So with Reinhart under contract, it's not really clear where he's going to play right now. Obviously, with you have Eichel and you have MIttlestadt as your potential 1 and 2 centers, with the guys that come over from St. Louis, like Saboka, for example, could be your number 3 center. So I think more than likely we're probably going to see Sam Reinhart play on the wing, which is something he's done before. So if it were me putting this together, this lineup, I would play Reinhart on the top line with Jack Eichel and Jeff Skinner. I think that would be a really solid number 1 line for the Sabres. They could also choose to play Reinhart on the second line as well, and maybe play either Kyle Okposo or Connor Sheary up there. But I think your second line more likely would be Casey MIttlestadt at center ice, possibly with Connor Sheary and Kyle Okposo. Either way, I think those wingers can be a little bit interchangeable. I mean, I know Sheary can play both wings, so he's a little bit more flexible in where you put him there. But either way, to me, that's a pretty solid top 6 group. Obviously, the guys that came over from St. Louis, I expect to probably be more so on your third line, with Saboka likely playing center, Berglund playing on the left side, and probably Tage Thompson playing on the right. I think that'd be a pretty solid third line for the Sabres this year. For the fourth line, I've got pegged as Rodriguez, Palmenville, and Scott Wilson. Obviously, they do have some other guys who can squeeze into that lineup as well. But that's how I would have the lineup here set for opening night for the Sabres for the upcoming 18-19 season. Now, lastly here, I'm going to take a look at the projection and predictions for me for the Sabres for the upcoming year. Now, I do expect a lot of improvement out of this team this year. There's no doubt. They've gone through a drastic overhaul, and this team looks very, very different this year compared to last. If you follow my NHL prediction series, you notice that I had them pegged to finish in 5th place in the Atlantic, up from 8th last year. So that's a nice step forward for this Buffalo Sabres team. Really, I think like their rookies are going to have a major impact. But my main question mark is in goal around the workload that Carter Hutton can handle and how will youngster Linus Ullmark do. Obviously, we'll see how they go. I mean, I do have a fair bit of confidence they'll do relatively well, but it's just hard to say until we see more of a sample size with Ullmark and being a full-time NHLer and Hutton being a full-time starter. One of the other big things will be Jack Eichel having a full healthy season. If he can finally put that together and really cement himself as being a top 10 player in the league, that's going to also go a long way to helping his team move forward, as well as move his career forward as well. So between a healthy Jack Eichel and some solid goaltending, you throw Rasmus Dahlin on the back end, Casey MIttlestadt, and a few other guys like Jeff Skinner in the top 6, I really think this team is going to drastically move forward. They could potentially move up a little higher than 5th, but I don't think really any higher than 4th is probably realistic. I do think teams like Toronto and Tampa, Boston, and even the Florida Panthers are more than likely going to finish ahead of them in the standings. But I do see the Sabres making some progress here in the right direction, jumping from 8th, possibly up as high as 5th. And then at least, maybe year over year, we can see them move up even further in years beyond that. But obviously, it takes time to get everything together. A lot of these guys are really young and need to learn how to win together as a group. So it will take some time. But I do see the Sabres finally making some steps in the right direction and really taking things up a notch here in the 18-19 season. So I'd love to hear your comments down below. Where do you see the Sabres finishing this year, and what do you expect them to accomplish in the upcoming season? I do think a couple of their dynamic rookies here will certainly compete for the Calder Trophy and certainly give Sabres fans a lot more to be excited this year than they have in a long time. If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button as well. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.